In this video, we're going to talk about how we can structure an application in today's modern Java world of enterprise application architecture by looking at the different layers which we typically have in an application and just talking through what we'd expect to see. So if we first off go to IDEA, and here we have a demo project. So if we just open up this project, so source, main, Java, the package, and demo application. So we don't have any code in here now, we're just going to create a few skeleton classes just to see what layering looks like in a real world application. So typically what you have in an application is you have different layers. So each layer is responsible for a different technical aspect of the application. And so I'll just put packages in now to demonstrate this layering. But for example, you might have layers such as packages such as web, business, data, for example. Now the actual names of these packages might change. Sometimes business might be called service or services. Sometimes data might be called persistence or database or DB. Web might be called web or controllers or presentation or something like that. But the key parts are that typically in a web-based application, which is split into a layered architecture, you have a controller. So here we'll just see we've got a controller, and the controller will be marked with the @controller annotation. And inside this controller, it'll basically need to access the layer underneath, which is the service layer or the business layer, to execute the actual business logic that whatever fulfills the needs of whatever web request that comes in. So for example here, you'll see we've got a service. Now we don't have a service at the minute, so let's just create that, for example. So create class myService. And this isn't going to exist in the presentation layer. Instead, this is going to exist in the layer underneath, which is the business layer. Now this service will be annotated with an @service annotation and will encapsulate the business logic of whatever needs to be done. And in order to execute that business logic, it's going to delegate out itself to a repository. So for example here, we can see we've got a repository, and again that's going to be auto wired in, and that's not going to exist in the business layer, it's going to exist in a separate layer which is in the data layer, and this is going to be of type repository, so it's going to be annotated with a repository annotation. So going from the top, we have a controller which has auto wired in through dependency injection, access to a service in the layer beneath, and then in turn that service, which is in the business layer as we can see here, has dependency injected into it a repository. Oops, typo there. And that repository in turn lives in the data layer, and that's going to be responsible for doing the actual database access logic. So what we're really seeing here is the fact that the controller only knows how to deal with things at the presentation level. So it only knows how to interpret HTTP servlet requests, how to produce HTTP servlet responses, or whatever abstraction the framework you're using, like Spring MVC for example, might use to represent those concepts. And there is no business logic in here whatsoever. That business logic is contained inside this business or service layer in separate services, which can be injected into this controller. It doesn't have to have just one service, it can be many different services injected into controller. And also there can be many different controllers as well, serving different types of use case for end users. So you might have a controller for placing orders, like an order controller. You might have a controller for looking at the product catalog, some kind of product controller, that kind of thing. But ultimately, the business logic you have for being able to return product catalog views to the user, to be rendered in the browser, or to place an order for a product, those kind of things. The logic for that will be done in the service layer in individual services. But similarly, that service layer will just contain business logic, and it doesn't know at all how to communicate with the database. It doesn't know anything about the actual structure of the database tables or anything like that, or about the entity relationship model. That's the responsibility of the data or persistence layer, and that's going to be coded in individual repositories. So in the repository, you'd expect to see methods in here like find all products, or find product by ID, or find product by name, that kind of thing, or save order, and things like that. The advantage of a layered architecture as well is that because you don't end up polluting an individual layer with any concerns of the layer beneath, in other words, because we don't have any business logic which is leaking into the controller, or we don't have any data access logic which is leaking into services, because we have a very clear separation of concerns and we partition things off into very discrete and very well-defined layers. Because of this, it means that we can actually swap out layers if we want to at a later date. So for example, one minute you might be using a relational database store for a particular repository, for example, for the product catalog, and then supposing your product catalog really grows, it really balloons up, it becomes huge, then it might make sense to move away from a relational database model because the database you're using, maybe it's creaking under its own weight, maybe using SQL Server, and there's just too much information in there, it's not really working. And you might decide you want to go to a NoSQL store. Or you might want to go to like a big data type in that aspect. Or for the service, you might, instead of just making plain vanilla calls out to repositories, you might decide that you need to have some kind of big data backed repository instead. And layering gives you the flexibility of being able to swap one layer out and replace it with another layer, providing you stick to the same interface. And that brings us to the other thing as well, where you can also put interfaces around these objects. So typically you'd have an interface for each service, interface for each repository, an interface for each controller, so that you can have that facility to be able to just program to the interface and then at a later date swap out for a different implementation as the needs of your application develops. Anyway, that's a very quick overview of how layering works in enterprise applications, and now you're in a good position to be able to understand and start developing your own enterprise apps.